The Good Old Grateful Deadcast, the official podcast of the Grateful Dead. I'm Rich Mahan with Jesse Jarno, exploring the music and legacy of the Grateful Dead for the committed and the curious. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Deadheads, welcome to Season 6 of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast. I'm your co-host, Rich Mahan. Thanks for tuning in to another deep dive into the world of the Grateful Dead. We're kicking off Season 6 with 2 episodes celebrating the 50th anniversary of what many Deadheads consider to be one of the best shows the band ever played. August 27, 1972 found the band on stage at a benefit for the Springfield Creamery in Veneta, Oregon. Well documented in the film Sunshine Daydream, this show sports vintage 72 Dead playing their hearts out for an enthusiastic crowd in scorching temperatures. Our website, dead.net/deadcast, has extra materials for you to explore from this episode. Also at dead.net/deadcast, all of our past episodes, including complete seasons 1 through 5. And you can link from there to your favorite podcasting platform so you can listen where you like to listen. Also new for you to explore are transcripts for many of the episodes in seasons 1 through 5. Head over to dead.net/deadcast-index and click the transcript link on the episode you'd like to explore. Thanks to everyone who has contributed their stories at stories.dead.net. A fair amount of you made it into the podcast, so thanks very much for your input. Were you at any of the Madison Square Garden shows in 81, 82, or 83? Well, if you were, we need your stories. Head over to stories.dead.net and record yours today. Speaking of MSG, boy, is there a cool new Grateful Dead box set heading our way. In and Out of the Garden, Madison Square Garden, 81, 82, 83. It boasts 17 CDs from 6 previously unreleased concerts recorded live in New York City at the famous Madison Square Garden between 81 and 83. Also available is Madison Square Garden, New York, 3981, a 3-CD set featuring 1 full show from the box. Both titles are available September 23rd and are available for pre-order now at dead.net. Also new to explore is the Grateful Dead server on Discord. Download the Discord app on your mobile device or computer and then search for the public Grateful Dead server and click the join button. Find the Deadcast channel and chat with fellow heads about the latest episode you just listened to. Jesse and I will pop on from time to time, so we'll see you there. It's summertime in August 1972. The monumentally successful Europe 72 tour is in the history books. The band is playing better than ever and gearing up for another tour in the U.S., but there are some friends in need of assistance up in Oregon. Get ready for a trip like no other to the Pacific Northwest. It's time to hand it off to Jesse Jarno.
On August 27, 1972, 2 months and 1 day after the conclusion of the Grateful Dead's Europe 72 tour, the band performed what some Dead freaks consider the most wonderful Dead show of all time. Billed as a potluck picnic to benefit the Springfield Creamery, the Dead performed 3 scorching sets at the Old Renaissance Fairgrounds in Veneta, Oregon, on what is sometimes reported as the hottest day in state history. Rhino released the show as Sunshine Daydream in 2013, along with a proper version of the not quite lost but never officially released documentary of the same name. Here at the Deadcast, we're not generally in the business of unilaterally declaring anything to be the greatest Grateful Dead show of all time, let alone believing that such a thing even exists. But that's actually an irrelevant conversation for another day. 8/27/72 is in a category of its own, and the music on tape is only part of the story. Grateful Dead archivist and legacy manager David Lemieux.
If I could go back in time to any moment in Grateful Dead history and see one Grateful Dead show, you got Cornell, you've got the Fillmore West run, the Live Dad run in 69. But the one show, without a doubt, as much as I would like to see a small theater show, maybe at the Lyceum on 5/26/72, it would be Veneta.
Oh, we'd sure like to thank the Springfield Creamery for making it possible for us to play out here in front of all you folks here and God and everybody. This is really where we get off the best.
And please welcome to the Grateful Deadcast, a founding editor of both Dupree's Diamond News and the Deadheads Taping Compendium, Johnny Dwork.
While Cornell 77 or The Late Show from the Fillmore East at 21370 might garner more votes as the people's favorite shows, having listened to pretty much every Grateful Dead tape in circulation, I've long held that the August 27th field trip is the most historically important, most culturally essential, and most experientially powerful Grateful Dead show in the band's long and deservedly legendary history. Personally, I also feel it's their finest performance, but of course that's admittedly a subjective opinion.
I don't know, this may be the first time I've ever been to Oregon. It didn't rain and now it's too damn hot.
And that's partly because of the setting of it as well. The music, first and foremost, but the setting, unbelievable. So that to me is the quintessential Grateful Dead experience.
The field trip, which was really the last acid test collaboration with the Merry Pranksters, happened at a time in which, unlike the original acid tests, the band had matured, they were well practiced, and they were performing at their technical and creative peak. Very different than when they first started doing collaborations with the Pranksters. They had, just a few months earlier, come off their incredible tour of Europe 72, which had them polishing to a gleaming shine many of the most beautiful, powerful, and widely acclaimed songs.
The Grateful Dead and the Alembic Sound Crew returned from Europe in late May 1972 with multi-track recordings of their tour, a topic we delved into just a tiny bit last season. They spent June listening to the tapes, and spent July starting to construct the overdubs for the November release of what would become a triple LP. The band played a half dozen out-of-town shows, but by the end of the month were back in the Bay Area working on the live album. And that's where they were on July 31st, working on vocal overdubs for Truckin' and Cumberland Blues, when emissaries from the distant prankster territory of Eugene arrived. Their friends needed help.
I gotta get down, I gotta get down, I gotta get down to
We're going to take a few detours before we get to the August 1972 show in Veneta to really explore why a field in rural Oregon is sometimes more than a field in rural Oregon. It's a cliche to say that the Grateful Dead were somehow more than a rock band, but this show is material proof. The Grateful Dead had musical peers in the rock scene, but they consciously and actively existed on a far broader continuum than just rock bands. To understand the importance of the music made at the Springfield Creamery benefit, it's necessary to understand not only the history of the Springfield Creamery, but how it both grew from and became a transformative institution in the Pacific Northwest that would have an impact on mainstream American culture. And to talk about that, we need to talk about Ken Kesey. You may know Ken Kesey from such powerful novels as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion, or such psychedelic harasses as the Merry Pranksters, who hosted the acid tests in 1965 and 1966, where the Dead served as house band.
You only come to this movie once, and if you don't get something rewarding out of every minute you're sitting there, then you're blowing your ticket.
Ken's brother Chuck was a prankster too, and we are thrilled beyond delight to welcome to the Good Old Grateful Dead cast from the Springfield Creamery, Chuck and Sue Kesey.
I was a bad prankster because I had a full-time job that was pressing me every day. So my ability to get away from my job is really rare.
Though the Kesey family name is often associated with Kool-Aid, the more appropriate beverage might actually be milk.
Well, the creamery happened kind of just organically, even though we didn't know that word in 1960. Chuck's father had been involved in the creamery business all the time, forever. And Chuck grew up in a creamery. And that's where we met, was at Oregon State University. And we had an opportunity when we graduated Chuck's father's creamery was looking for someone to package milk in glass gallon jugs, which was kind of a throwback to the early 50s at that point, because all the creameries that were in business in the late 50s, early 60s had kind of moved on to the modern things of paper cartons and so forth, and glass was not there. So there was this former creamery building in Springfield that was not occupied, and Chuck and his dad worked out a thing where we could set up a little processing plant. We would just package milk in gallon jugs and sell it to other creameries who wanted this product to distribute.
In 1961, just after Ken Kesey sold the manuscript for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but before its publication, he returned to Springfield, Oregon, the town of his youth, and took a summer job at the Springfield Creamery.
Ken did work for us while he was writing Great Notion or Cuckoo's Nest. They were so close together, I can't remember but it was when they were living in Oregon for a bit. And it was in the early 60s, 61, 63. Yeah, and he was a great plant man. He was raised in a creamery too, so it worked well.
According to Rick Dodgson's splendid biography, It's All a Kind of Magic, The Young Ken Kesey, the author also came with a supply of psychedelics liberated from the closet at the Veterans Hospital where he'd worked nights and written Cuckoo's Nest. The job didn't last long, and Brother Ken was soon working on Sometimes a Great Notion, inspired by his time back in the Northwest. In the summer of 1964, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters purchased the Harvester bus they named Further and drove to New York for the publication party of Sometimes a Great Notion, not to mention the World's Fair. Brother Chuck turns up in Tom Wolfe's electric Kool-Aid acid test. Did he take the summer off to join the pranksters?
Never.
He was gone maybe 2 weeks, I think, maybe.
One of the longest vacations I've ever had. This is the truth.
True.
This is the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. The creamery is very pressing.
2 weeks getting there, but he flew back. I flew out and met them. And I was pregnant with Kit, with our son, so I didn't attempt the bus trip.
In the acid tests, I went to most of them. I missed one. I went to the first one and took Cheryl, my daughter, who is 5 at the time. And she and I went. She got into it early. And all in all, she and I were the only ones that had not taken acid. And our job during the concert was to go around and give people ice cubes. And so we passed ice cubes out to the hard dancing hippies.
The 60s unfolded, and a funny thing happened. Yogurt.
Yogurt?
You've heard of it? I was recently doing some other Dead-related research and came across an otherwise unrelated article that referred to the ethos of the 60s as peace, love, and yogurt. 50 years later, it's maybe a little easy to forget why yogurt might be thought of as part of the psychedelic revolution, but the connection was due in no small part to the Kesey family.
Initially, we only packaged gallons, and then we eventually started doing some home delivery on our own. And we also did milk for the Springfield School District and the little half-pint containers that went to the schools and every morning. And we ran that all through the 60s, all the way up until for almost 10 years. But Chuck really wanted to do cultured products. He wanted to do yogurt. This is what they had drilled into him at Oregon State. This was the best of the best to do cultured products.
So it was in the late 1960s that the Springfield Creamery got countercultural.
Early in probiotic, before the word had been invented, and we put in acidophilus, and our inspectors told us that we couldn't put it in there in yogurt. They said this is illegal, and I realized that they didn't know how to test. And I knew the right thing. I knew that I was supposed to put it in there. So we were pretty close to being the first people to do that. I'd been taught well at Oregon State in bacteriology, and I knew it was the right answer.
Chuck's a great future looker. And this is what people wanted. They wanted real food that was really good for you.
Please welcome to the Deadcast, Joshua Clark Davis, author of the exceptional scholarly book published by Columbia University Press, From Head Shops to Whole Foods, The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast.
It's yogurt, it's tofu, it's organic produce. If you go back to the 60s, I mean, if you think about the counterculture in a way, it's a rebellion against the dominant commercial culture, right? And I think organic food and vegetarianism all the way back in the 60s was itself a subculture that was rebelling against the larger commercial culture around food, around supermarkets, around the A&Ps and the Safeways and so on. And it really began to blossom in places like New York on the East Coast, on the West Coast, Bay Area, especially the macrobiotic movement. That was getting really big in the mid 60s, right before the counterculture was taking off. I hate to use this term synergy, but it's like the things that were happening between music, drugs, food, counterculture, it's all kind of clicking in right at that moment. And I think there's an argument that maybe like 1972 in some ways is kind of like maybe the biggest kind of last year for the counterculture. Obviously, the counterculture goes on for decades, but as long as the war in Vietnam is still going and Nixon hasn't been reelected yet, there's some urgency there.
What was then known as the health food business existed as one of the most successful outgrowths of the counterculture. But those associations came with a price. In From Head Shops to Whole Foods, Josh gets deep into the story of E01 Market. One of their earliest managers, Paul Hawken, went from the civil rights movement to San Francisco's Calliope Light Show to the health foods business.
E01, at their first store in Boston in 1966, they got raided by the FDA for, in the FDA's eyes, selling unlicensed health advice or kind of things that was bordering on unlicensed medical advice. So these businesses, it seems so unthreatening today, things like yogurt, tofu, organic produce, but they did threaten people in certain ways because that countercultural connotation was so strong, right? This is what freaks ate. This is what heads ate. This was not necessarily safe because you didn't know what those folks were also putting in their bodies, right? There was something else going on there that I think some people were very suspicious of.
This is all part of the background to the event that would result in the Grateful Dead coming to play in Veneta, what is known in creamery lore as the apple wine incident, when some employees wound up with a batch of apples and decided to try their hand at winemaking.
I picked the yogurt at that time at about 2 a.m. That's when the yogurt was ready, and that was my job. And I'd go to the creamery at 2 a.m. and walk through it. And usually I would find footprints of somebody that was in front of me, and this was normal. And this time it went to the apple wine and pulled the plug and spilled 200 gallons of
Apple mash
in the warehouse. Yeah, what a nightmare. Who would do that? But I could track them, and I knew who. I could tell by their footprint that they were wearing good shoes. So I shoveled it back in the vat because it couldn't drain. It was just on the floor. And I shoveled it back in the vat. And so they had ruined it. And I thought, well, I can distill it. And I stretched a piece of plastic over the top of the vat and put a little coil on it and put a steam in it and went home. And at 8 a.m, I came back and it was full of cops, like 25 cops in the Eugene Register Guard. Our local newspaper had already gathered, waiting for me to come. And they loved the story. It was so dynamic. And in the long run, I got fined $75 for doing it. But it knocked us out of our normal business cycle.
Our reputation went down the drain with the apples.
The man was ready to go after the yogurt heads.
It was no accident. They lied about what we were doing and how much we were doing.
They subsequently lost their contract with the local schools. In 1970, the Springfield Creamery put their faith fully in yogurt. Yogurt! In 1970, the creamery launched perhaps its most famous product, Nancy's Honey Yogurt, named after Nancy Van Bresch Hamren.
Nancy came to work for us in 1969. She had moved up to Oregon with her boyfriend, who was Mountain Girl's brother, to stay at the farm while Ken and Faye and the kids had gone to England to hang out with the Beatles for a while.
As one does. We are just honored to welcome Nancy Hamren. Unlike Wavy Gravy, the nationally distributed food product named for her is actually good for you.
I had been raised in the Bay Area, and then in the middle of my senior year in high school, we moved to Pasadena. So I lasted about a year and a half in Southern California. It was so different, from the Bay Area, where there was jazz and beatniks and philosophical things going on, that were of interest. So I moved back in January 66, lived right over the top of the guys who were practicing that would become the Jefferson Airplane. Our apartment was right over there, so that was fun. And I was just a hippie in the Haight-Ashbury for 2 years.
Nancy was quite literally a member of the Grateful Dead family.
So when I lived with Gordon, we were in Marin County and pretty close to where Mountain Girl and Jerry lived. So we'd go over and visit them in Larkspur and see Sunshine, this beautiful little curly blonde-haired girl.
But the invitation came from the Keseys to hold down the farm.
Gordon and I went, yeah, it's time to get out of California. So we moved to Ken's farm and stayed there for 6 months, learned how to feed animals and feed lots of people on brown rice and greens and grow an organic garden and all that. It was a great summer. And then Woodstock happened. And so they hired the Kesey farmsters to load up some school buses and go back and help manage the backstage at Woodstock. I had been in San Francisco. We went endlessly to the dances, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, everybody. It was such a great music scene, Grateful Dead, of course. And I just didn't want to ride on a school bus for 3,000 miles with a bunch of people I would not normally have liked as friends, shall we say, some of them. So it turned out that was a really good decision. So the farm emptied, and Ken came back from England and said, okay, the farm's closed now. It used to be, it was a place where people could crash, and there were parties, and it was quite the fun farm event. I was 22. I needed to find a direction in life.
Nancy was there, and she needed actually to make some money, and we needed a bookkeeper because our bookkeeper was wanting to move on. And so we hired her. She came to the office. She didn't leave for 45 years. Absolutely the best hire, one of the best hires we ever made. And so this is when we were in this transition period of saying, well, what are we going to do? Let's make yogurt. And Chuck wanted to make yogurt.
They wanted to pivot to a new direction and find something that was unique and would benefit people. Honestly, we were looking to make everybody's gut better than it was. So I had been making yogurt at home.
Nancy said, gosh, I can't find any good yogurt up here in Oregon at all. And this is what my grandma used to make. And she and Chuck worked together. They were great. And Chuck knew what he wanted, and Nancy had a great palate as well. That's what became Nancy's Honey Yogurt.
Chuck had sent away for some acidophilus and some yogurt cultures for me, and started just perfecting it at home in glass gallon jars on the back of a stove in a water bath, or half gallons, I guess, in a water bath. And came up with a really good yogurt. And they said, well, let's try selling your yogurt here. Somebody will buy it. Right then, a student co-op opened up, Willamette People's Co-op. So I would do the books, the payroll and the office managing and the all that, and then I would put on boots and a white coat and go out and make yogurt in a little 30-gallon vat. And the co-op bought our yogurt, It didn't have a name. It was just yogurt from Springfield Creamery. One day they called up to order some more, and she's manager, Marlena, from New York. She called up and said, "Give me some of that Nancy's yogurt." It just got named for us. Somebody bestowed that name, and the thing was Chuck and Sue loved it, and they named it that.
In some ways, the yogurt was just the hottest new technology to come down the hippie pipeline. Richard Sutton would go on to work for the creamery.
The yogurt was really special. There was nothing being marketed anywhere in the country like it, as far as the living cultures and everything. I could hear the reaction from people that I knew on the streets in Eugene and the area around there, and from people that I knew from various other commune farms. It was almost spoken of in reverent tones, as though you were talking about something that was in the Whole Earth catalog. If you go back far enough, it carried a lot of cred. It really did.
Lawrence Roberts is the author of the incisive book, May 1971, A White House at War, A Revolt in the Streets, and the Untold Story of America's Biggest Mass Arrest. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast. He was spending the summer of 1972 in Eugene.
I shared the feeling of a lot of folks who were coming out of college or in college at the time, which I was involved as a protester in the Vietnam anti-war movement starting in 1969. Went to various protests. I was arrested as part of the biggest mass arrest in U.S. history in Washington in May of 1971 in a big attempt by anti-war groups to do a traffic blockade of the city to protest Richard Nixon and the war. So this was a year later. I think by then the particular kind of actions of going into the streets and protesting, carrying signs and picketing had pretty much faded away. People had felt it was not effective, or they had just sort of moved on and turned more inward. And this idea that the cultural part of things was where they should put their energies. The Oregon area reflected that. I mean, I think there were some people who were involved in politics, directly in politics, but most of the idea was, let's just create something different. Let's create an alternative. Everything was about alternative schools, alternative food, alternative music.
The Springfield Creamery had figured out the alternative food, and now it was time to spread it to the world. It's one thing to operate a local creamery. It's another to manufacture a new product. There was no distribution chain to just get their yogurt into supermarkets. But there was an emerging network of natural food stores connected into the heady hippie underground. Nancy's Honey Yogurt found its first Bay Area representative via a distributor of rock magazines and underground comics.
So there was a great guy named Gilbert Rossborn who was taking comic books from, I'm not quite sure whether they were published in Eugene and he hauled them down to the Bay Area and distributed, or if he did the other way, if he brought books from the Bay Area up to here. I think it must have been that way, because then he was empty going back.
It was a backhaul.
Yeah. And he said, well, I'm going to all those stores and all the natural food stores, and they're really longing for good products. Why don't I take the yogurt down? And that became the original connection into the Bay Area with our yogurt going there. And eventually Gilbert quit doing comic books pretty much and created a business called Natural Foods Express and did distribution of dairy products and other things, and into Marin County down to Santa Cruz, all during the 70s. There were a lot of businesses like us who were creating new foods, and all these natural food stores that were popping up everywhere needed things to put on their shelves and in their refrigerated cases. You know, we were taking it to local natural food stores in Eugene, and gosh, we were making sometimes 200 gallons a day.
In my book, From Head Shops to Whole Foods, part of the whole idea of the title is that there was kind of this universe of activist businesses, countercultural businesses that emerged in the late 60s, and there was overlap in different ways, kind of this constellation of head shops, the comic book stores, the natural food stores. Maybe they didn't always sell each other's products, but there was a good chance they were often in the same neighborhoods, or there was actual kind of cross-pollination, like you said. And That doesn't surprise me, especially not on the West Coast and especially not in college towns, right? So Springfield Creamery is basically right next to Eugene, right next to University of Oregon. And that's a big part of the story as well.
But wait, there's more.
Partner with Huey Lewis.
Huey Lewis?
Yes, that's the other part of the story. His partner in Natural Foods Express was Huey Lewis. And Huey was the struggling singer and who sang at night and drove yogurt in the daytime. Huey always said that he wrote Working for a Living while he was driving their truck down to Santa Cruz to make deliveries.
It was the windshield wiper.
Working for a living, working for a living, working for a living, living and working. I'm taking what they're giving because I'm working for a living.
Please welcome Huey Lewis.
We started a little Whole Foods distribution company based on Nancy's yogurt. Our business was called Natural Foods Express. We started with Nancy's yogurt, but we had all kinds of other natural foods as well.
Huey often made the trip from the Bay Area to Springfield.
Yogurt needs to be refrigerated, but it's quite stable, actually. So in the beginning, truth be told, we would drive the truck up to Eugene. It was 9 hours to get up there, and we'd get up there about 9 or 10 at night, and then load the truck and take a nap at Rosanna's house, and then get in the truck and drive to the Bay Area, and then go to our various and distribute it as well, same day. Before we had the walk-in. Then we got the walk-in, then we could put it in the walk-in, and then we got to ship it down after a while, so we didn't have to drive up. Clover was going during this period as well. I was doing this in the daytime and then gigs at night, and burning the candle at both ends, no question about it.
Huey Lewis was and is a true member of the Creamery family, though didn't make it to the 72 benefit.
I wasn't there, but we did a show for the Creamery, and I can't remember when that was. They partnered up with a promoter, and we did a show and benefited them a little bit, and that was a really fun gig. Ken was on the farm, and Chuck had the Creamery, Chuck and Sue, and they're just the greatest people in the world. They're rock solid Oregon people, and Nancy, worked there forever, and they named the yogurt after her. And Rosanna, I think Rosanna had the fruit. I think Rosanna's idea was the fruit, and Rosanna now lives married a friend of mine, Wally Lourdeau, and lives in Marin County. I still see them, and I coach their kid. So it's all pretty much family, for me. But yeah, they're just great people.
He's not kidding. In 1993, Huey was participating in Twister, one of Brother Ken's stage productions, and the entire gaggle went to see the Dead at Autzen Stadium in Eugene, closing the circle with Huey's old yogurt route.
They had a big gig in Eugene, and I was there as part of Kesey's crazy entourage, and they asked me to sit in. And I remember it was the first time I'd ever had in-ear monitors. The Dead were, I think, the first people to do that. I guess I had a harmonica with me. He said, "What do you got?" "We'll do something in E, whatever." And so I said, "Great." They gave me a microphone that was connected to an amplifier somewhere in the back line of this enormous stage. I didn't know where the amplifier. They just kind of handed me the microphone and stuck these two things in my ears. And by the way, they had the system where they had in-ear monitors, but they also had a little button that you could push, which would defeat the in-ear monitors so they could talk to each other and say to the monitor guy, "Hey, I need a little more drums," or "I need a little more of this," or whatever. And then let their foot unpress the button, and then it would go out through the microphone. So I'm hearing them talk at the same time I'm hearing music, and I don't know where the music's from. It was the strangest notion ever. And I'm trying to play my harmonica, and I can't tell if I can hear it or not. I hear this terrible sound, and I realize, oh shit, it's my harmonicas feeding back, right? And now I look into the back of the stage, and Jerry, who figured this out way before I did, is already back there with his back turned to the crowd in the very back line, working with my amp, trying to get me nice tone. And he did that for the whole song. I thought it was so sweet, man.
Sorry, we had the timesheet set for the wrong decade. Let me just shake it. But the Creamery wasn't just yogurt. Some communities anchor themselves around music scenes or bookstores or bars. Springfield, Oregon got a health food store.
Springfield didn't have a natural food store when they were all in Eugene. We thought, well, we could do that. We had a lot of people coming into the office and wanting to buy yogurt and so forth. And we really weren't set up to sell yogurt from the front office because it was about as big as a closet. So we just started putting together a food store where we had bulk food and binge, just like the natural food stores looked. And it was called the Health Food and Pool Store. And the reason it was named that was because we had a wonderful pool table in that room which was the break room for our employees. Nobody wanted to give up the pool table. We ended up building a big log platform because the room was really high ceilinged, and put the pool table up overhead on a platform. People could come up and play pool if they wanted. That's how my son and daughter became pool sharks at a very young age. And so anyway, the pool table was there for a long time. The store was delightful. The store was a wonderful gathering place for folks. We loved it. It was open until 1987 or so, when actually the whole creamery moved over to our current location in Eugene.
You could come in the store. The grains and all were stored in 10-gallon milk cans, and you could play pool for free. We had a big Fisher stove, so people would stand around and talk politics. It was a hub of interest and community. It was a small community, most people were pretty, let's see, we used to call them square, straight, whatever the word is these days.
Joshua Clark Davis.
Why not have the yogurt, the organic food, and the antique billiard table all in the same place? I mean, we just watched Licorice Pizza, and this is kind of, really appealed to me because it had some of this type of stuff. It's like the waterbed store, and just then the guy goes on to do a pinball shop, and people were kind of mixing and matching these small business ideas in this period. Not afraid to try new things, and very much shaped by the counterculture. Even folks who weren't like totally embedded in it, they were kind of breathing that air. It was in the atmosphere.
Opened in 1970, the Health Food and Pool Store quickly became a local hangout. David Koranda.
It just became a kind of a natural gathering space, and that the yogurt was awesome and the people were awesome, and it wasn't very big. So you got to know people who went in there, and they got to know each other, and you saw the same people, etc. And so it was just very laid back, and unlike any other store, I think, that you would naturally go into, and certainly different than a place where you would go buy groceries or yogurt or something like that.
Please welcome to the Deadcast, Ace Dead Freak Strider Brown.
I have to say that Eugene in 71 and 72 was, the closest I will have ever gotten to, let's say, the original Haight-Ashbury. And there was still, at least for myself, a certain feeling of innocence.
Richard Sutton scored a job as manager at the Health Food and Pool Store.
Before I went to the creamery, was working at the Kiva bookstore in Eugene, which was on the road to the campus, and learning all kinds of weird stuff, including how to throw tarot cards. So it's all kind of a blend. It all came together.
The store launched far more than Nancy's yogurt.
The Health Food and Pool Store was a place for people to bring their small kitchen-made products that were approved by the Department of Agriculture, of course. You have to be certified. But it was a place for people to sell their stuff. The Kettle Chips guy was one of our first distributors who took Nancy's yogurt up to Portland and down to Ashland. Well, first he started out, there weren't very good roasting nuts. So he came up with the idea that he would supply the roasted nuts to the stores and provide them with a peanut butter machine. And people could make it, just like grinding your own coffee, you could make your own peanut butter. So Kettle Chips started out that way, and then he realized that there was only like Laura Scudder potato chips that he started making these trial batches, small batches of Kettle Chips, and it grew from there. And he was a dear, dear friend. Poolside Bakery was Esther and a fellow who made granola. We had some government ovens, some pizza ovens that we had bought on government surplus. So they started making granola in the back of the pool store and selling it in the store. And that turned it. So then Golden Temple took over that and created their own line of, I think it's called Sweet Home granola. Now you see it in the grocery stores in those milk carton shapes. Started at the creamery, in the back of the creamery. Serrata Soy Foods, of course, is a local soy tofu company that made their first batch at the creamery. There's just lots of connections, natural food connections that the creamery has helped.
There was more than yogurt at stake. It was an attempt to radically redefine the food market in the United States. But in launching a new yogurt, a new store, and helping to support a network of comrade food makers, the debts were beginning to pile up.
It was a struggle. Nowadays, if you were a startup with a really good idea, you would seek out some investment money, to help you get up and running. And that wasn't really available back then. That wasn't a thing people did. And so you just kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, really. So we were making this great yogurt, probably one of the best probiotic yogurts in America, if not the best. And we just needed to you have to buy containers and honey and milk and labor, that you have to try to make it work within that cycle of sales and purchasing. So we were having trouble with going to be unable to pay our federal taxes. It was probably payroll taxes. And we needed some kind of good idea to pull us out of this dilemma.
We didn't have any money. All we had was determination. We weren't going to quit. So we asked the Grateful Dead.
I think maybe Jim Benny thought up the idea, what if the Dead did a benefit for us? It's kind of, okay, let's try. They have a connection to Ken, and we can at least get an interview with them. So Chuck and Bud and Black Maria. So Chuck Kesey, Ken's brother, Bud Haxby, Faye's brother, and Black Maria, one of the pranksters, drove down. And the Dead were rather democratic, but even the roadies had a seat at the table where decisions were made. So they went down and proposed it, and their head roadie was a guy named Ramrod, and he was from Pendleton, Oregon.
Ramrod had joined the Merry Pranksters during Ken Kesey's escape to Mexico in early 1966, before arriving at the Dead's house in the Haight later that year with the message, "Kesey sent me. I hear you need a good man."
And he spoke up for us, and he said, these are good people. They need to be saved. This is worth doing. And they agreed.
In early September, they'd be setting off for a cross-country tour, but they did have a free weekend at the end of August. The band's August newsletter had tentatively announced a show at the Santa Barbara County Bowl on August 27th, but that evaporated, as gigs sometimes do, and the Dead committed to help the creamery. Well, it wasn't unusual for the Dead to play a benefit. It was slightly more so to play for an out-of-town organization.
We had 28 days from the yes to
the date they picked.
Which is a pretty phenomenal statement. And at that point, I had never been to an outdoor concert. Eugene, I think, had never had an outdoor concert. And so there was no concept of it. And so there was no prototype. There was nothing to copy. This is total invention on how to do this.
They had a venue in mind, too, about 15 miles west of Eugene in the town of Veneta. And like the Springfield Creamery, the old Renaissance Fairgrounds were already home to an important local landmark and countercultural institution. What was then called the Oregon Renaissance Fair was founded nearby in 1969 and moved to its permanent home on the Long Tom River the following year. Larry Roberts.
One aspect of the counterculture was this movement called the free school movement, which was a way, and the counterculture believed, to set up a system of schools for their kids that weren't part of the system. And so these independent schools were popping up all over. My project was to sort of study these schools, and the one I ended up going to visit at was a place called the Children's Community School, which at that time was located on a farm not far outside of Eugene, One of the things that the people before me did to raise money for this free school, for the Children's Community School, was to set up this annual event called the Renaissance Fair.
We knew that property, that the fair had been there for a couple of years on that property. But it was rented. They leased, the fair leased the land for the fair. And so we went to the landlord and said, well, can we lease this field, this part of the field here for this concert for, a couple of weeks, so we get it for this month, actually. And he said, sure. He was really nice guy.
Like the health food movement, the Renaissance Fair as an institution has what might seem like surprising connections to the counterculture and to the Dead's world specifically. Owsley Stanley and his crew of LSD makers were regulars at the Northern California fairs. One of those associates and close friends, Bob Thomas, would do the final illustration for the Dead's Skull and Lightning Bolt logo, to bear specs, of course. He also played bagpipes in the Golden Toad, known to some as the Grateful Dead of the Ren Fair circuit. With no official releases, recordings are extremely rare and have only surfaced in the past few years. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast. But while the Renaissance Fair evolved, the Oregon iteration became very much its own, and would change their name to the Oregon Country Fair in 1976, after the California Ren Fair's threatened lawsuit because, essentially, the Oregon Fair wasn't Ren enough. In Veneta, it wasn't so much about dressing in period garb and speaking in dialect, as it was about extremely heady craft work, family-friendly circus flair, and getting deeply lost, in the woods or elsewhere. If you're interested in the history of Renaissance fairs, I recommend Rachel Lee Rubin's book, Well Met, Renaissance Fairs and the American Counterculture. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast, naturally. And by naturally, I mean organically.
Shortly after I got there in June of 72, this was like the second or third Renaissance Fair, which I attended, and it was an amazing, event. And this was the same grounds, of course, where the Springfield Creamery fundraiser was held, about 6 weeks later. It was this winding trail through the woods, beautiful woods of Oregon, with all these booths set up by people who were selling crafts and doing music or learning to blacksmith or showing you how to grow organic vegetables. And we had a booth for this free school I'm talking about that we manned. Lots of civilians came during the day. At night, there was just campfires. Like I said, everybody had guitars and mandolins and fiddles, and so it was like an all-night kind of counterculture camp with clouds of marijuana smoke and everything else.
The 1972 iteration of the Oregon Fair took place from June 30th through July 2nd, during an early summer heat wave. One history of the fair recalls the institution in 1972 of what became known as the purple sock rule for men. Let's just call that foreshadowing. The Oregon Renaissance Fair was a lot of cool things, but it definitely didn't resemble a rock festival, or even a folk festival.
At that time, you couldn't rent a stage. And in 28 days, you could not rent a stage and get it there.
We had to build a perimeter fence and then build a stage. So there were all these volunteer hippie carpenters and young people who were out there just making it happen.
The creamery is good at engineering because it's a complicated machine, that creamery is. And we built a city in 28 days and had a concert.
With a lot of help. It
was mostly volunteers. Almost everything was volunteers. Yeah. And the stage was built with volunteers. And in 28 days, you couldn't get a ticket printed either. So we had to make our own ticket.
We used our yogurt cup labels as the tickets, and we just printed over them.
The creamery staff just cranked out a ticket. Click, 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 click. They just knocked out a ticket.
I think it was $3 or $3.50 at the gate. And the tickets were printed on Nancy's yogurt labels. We, of course, didn't have enough money to even silkscreen our containers. They were pick and stick labels. And I think maybe the Kiva sold tickets, Sundance, the Student Union. And we had posters around town. So people came from all over. They heard about this concert from Seattle to California, just came from all over to be there. And I think we sold about 13,000 tickets.
There were, of course, posters. One of them featured intricate lettering, a clear glass milk bottle with a haloed head of a cow, and the word Renaissance misspelled. The art was by the hog farmer, Merry Prankster, and visual artist Paul Foster, then living in Springfield and doing occasional work as fall posters. Some nice wordplay on his name. The other poster was hand-lettered with a rapidograph by a creamery employee named Richard Sutton.
I was doing the graphics here and there, and they asked me to do the poster, and I said, sure. I did a couple of signs up on campus for restaurants. I did some small band local concert things and graphics that they used on drum heads and stuff. I had my trusty rapidograph and my India ink bottle. A lot of the illustration I did at the time, point by point by point by point, on a big pad of vellum paper, which is kind of like tissue, only really heavy, so that you could do a lot of ink work on it, and then it was easy to put it over something else if you needed to back it up. I hadn't really learned much about the graphic arts business, but I knew I liked to do illustrations. So you do what you do. I think I took the skeleton, I borrowed that, I traced it probably off an older Dead album.
At the natural food stores, I think, is where the posters all went up, all up and down the coast.
There was one guy decided that it was his job to hit every bar in Oregon and walk into the bar with a poster and say, there's a Grateful Dead concert coming. And here it is, and off he'd go.
Johnny Dwork.
This show was literally played off the grid on sacred land that had been inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years on a brilliant summer day away from the psychically constricting forces of the default society paradigm that we all know the Grateful Dead were trying to move away from, that the whole culture of the time was trying to move away from. There were no cops, no confining walls, no industry promoters. This confluence of expansive forces was both, I think, profoundly empowering and also really well timed for the arc of their career.
The show existed almost entirely inside the emerging alternative society of which the Dead were a part. That same summer, they were beginning to explore the idea of starting their very own record company and distribution system. It was do-it-yourself at virtually every level. But looked at another way, it's like a wholesome musical. To save the family dairy, the kids are going to get together and put on a show. Enter a film crew. The film, now known as Sunshine Daydream, was directed by John Norris and produced by Sam Field. Sadly, neither are with us anymore, but I did interview Sam in 2013 when writing my book Heads, a biography of psychedelic America.
John Norris was the instigator of the whole idea to film a concert. And he had been a film guy in New York, did some stuff with WNET, and kind of was my childhood friend outside New York, and lured me to California originally, took me to my first lathered up Grateful Dead show, and got me on the bus.
After trying to contact the Dead's management, in February 1972, collaborator Phil Daguerre went to go see Jerry Garcia play with Merle Saunders and told him they wanted to make a movie. Daguerre recalled to Blair Jackson in 1986, he seemed sort of bemused by the idea that anyone would want to make a movie about a bunch of musicians who stand on stage and stare at their guitar strings. Sunshine Daydream's filmmakers have passed on, but Adrian and Marin both helped them restore and release the project, and also directed his own wonderful mini-documentary, Grateful Days. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast. More than anybody else, Adrian is the keeper of the Sunshine Daydream flame.
Europe 72 tour comes about. Sam Cutler calls them up and says, hey guys, I think this is your chance. This might be the one to come and check it out on. And they're like, well, we'd like to come and sort of travel with you guys, but we really need to, do some more homework, we feel.
In the spring, John and Sam headed to Europe and followed the Dead on pretty much the entirety of the Europe 72 tour. Not quite riding with the band, but intersecting frequently. We included some of Sam talking about it in our Denmark episode last season. though it's one of the many topics I wish I could ask him about more.
And so it was while on that tour, I think, that like an uncle or something of Sam's died, left him just a little chunk of loot.
Every day things were looking more plausible. Sometime after they got back, it seems that documentarians Albert and David Maisels, famous for Gimme Shelter, had contacted the Dead about making a documentary. Initially, they were told to talk to Norris, DeGuere, and Field, who the band seemed to consider the band's film team. The Maisels fell out of the picture, and soon Sunshine Daydream was born.
Earlier in July of that summer, the band did a Portland and Seattle Paramount Theater brief tour. And that was the first time I'd ever been to Oregon, going to those shows. And like I say, John and I spent our youth in the New York area and then came to California in late 60s and found plenty to do around here without really going very far.
I got another call from Cutler saying, hey, this is really maybe the one, guys. I think you got to get up there. This is promising to be a pretty loose affair, and it's going to happen really quick.
And we didn't know where or when the opportunity to film a concert would show up. Could have just as easily been in the Bay Area or in any other state. So it just sort of happened that the opportunity was there. So all of a sudden we became familiar, and then we stayed and lived there for a year doing editing and a lot of the post-production.
The filmmakers connected with a group known as Far West Action Picture Services, with the excellent acronym of FWAPS, which I assume to be a Don Martin-style onomatopoeia for the sound of when a film reel runs out. Fwap, fwap, fwap. Co-founded by Merry Prankster Mike Hagan, FWAPS was a heady, hippie-style film and television company doing local television and film work. With a team of John Norris, Phil DeGuere, and Sam Field, they caught underground America circa 1972 at perhaps its deepest. Cameras started rolling as the old-fashioned stage racing began.
The other thing showing our novice concert promotion side was that when we built the stage, we didn't really take into consideration the direction we were facing the stage. So actually the stage faced west, and consequently the band had the sun in their face on a day that was over 100 degrees for at least the last half of the day, maybe all day, certainly as the sun got to that level in the sky. It was where they were having trouble keeping their guitars in tune and didn't think their music sounded very good, and all of that. A lot came from that position of the stage.
The volunteers the Creamery rounded up for their stage racing, and indeed much of the audience for the show, came from the communes and alternative living situations in the area around Eugene. David Koranda.
There were a number of different communes at that time all around Eugene, and all of them had different things. One of them was related to food. One of them, I remember, was related to Christianity, etc.
Camille Cole.
There were a lot of communes in the area. There was the Mud Farm, the Goat Farm, the Church of the Creative, all the hillsides around that area were dotted with various types of communes. And we would go and visit each other, and it was definitely a family. And not long after that, I took up with I guess you'd call it a gypsy caravan, and we were the bus farm. You can picture a fleet of Victorian houses meandering down the highway, house truck, Victorian houses on the back of flatbed trucks. We raised the roof on our school bus and extended the back end. So people would pull over and wave, and we took a cross-country trip, and we were on TV in Nashville. They took us up to Graceland in Memphis. We were on display at the New York State Fair. So there's a lot of adventures in there.
Camille has a memoir coming out.
The Midnight Show, Bohemians, Byways, and Bonfires.
We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast. Founded the year before, The Hodads Reforestation Cooperative was a worker-owned collective that very intentionally made literal roots in the area. Strider.
The Hodads were absolutely their own. Certainly they were like a cooperative that was based, of course, on tree planting and other work in the woods.
During one of the early country fairs, they were having some problems with the Hells Angels, who wanted to take over the child care area and park their bikes there. So they asked the Hodads if they would do security. Plus, there were a lot of traffic jams up on the road. So the Hodads took over security. So in those days, the Hodads were sort of the savior.
Working with foreman Paige Browning of the Merry Pranksters, the Hodads also helped build the stage.
Loosely, the Grateful Dead and the people who were part of the Grateful Dead family were part of that group as well. Even though the Dead didn't specifically live in this area, there were people connected to them who did. And so the band were sort of peripherally part of our community.
One of those was the Church of the Creative. Richard Sutton of the Springfield Creamery lived there.
I moved out to a commune in Cresswell, and actually before that, around the college, I got to know a guy named Gordon Adams, and his sister is Mountain Girl, Carolyn. It was a place called the Church of the Creative down in Cresswell. It was basically a mountain valley that had been purchased and had an old farmhouse on it, but really the idea was to go into the hills and build your own shelters and raise goats, which I found out I really like goats, and we got along really well. We all took turns helping each other build the construction work that we did. I remember meeting a guy who was putting up a really big house. It had at least 3 stories down the hill from the little cabin that I had. He was up there on the roof. Well, at the time it was just rafters, balancing himself and making really, really intricate joint cuts with a chainsaw that he held in his hand. And the thing that got me about this is that I noticed his other hand didn't work. He was just balancing with his legs and cutting joints with a chainsaw. He turned out to be quite an interesting guy, actually. He was well known at the University of Oregon. He was one of the people that did a lot of theatrical work there. He was a great actor. Later, he and David Lynch met. And the one-armed man in Twin Peaks is that guy. His name is Al Strobel. And he was just a good buddy and taught me all kinds of stuff.
The magician longs to see one chance out between 2 worlds. Fire, walk with me.
Nancy remembers Al Strobel, too.
His house, he built this really quirky house, an absolute hobbit house on that property down there, and it's still there.
Weirdos and David Lynch fans of all stripes, this is crazy, but please welcome to the Deadcast from Twin Peaks, Philip Gerard, a.k.a. Mike, the actor Al Strobel.
I had a terrible car accident when I was 17 and had the nerves from my left arm pulled out of the spinal column. And so I've been in excruciating pain all my life. And I had a near-death experience during that. And I fought like hell to come back here to live out this life. But I was only 17, and I figured there must be more. And there sure as hell has been.
Which is one of the ways that Al ended up co-founding the Church of the Creative with Mountain Girl's brother, Gordon Adams. Al became a resourceful and creative architect.
It was a very interesting adventure. I got to build a 1,000-square-foot cabin there that was remarkable, I think. The whole south side, 2 stories with window. You had a beautiful view of the opposing little mountain across the valley, and then you went upstairs, and there were the bedrooms up there, about a half a story high, and a little bit higher was the kitchen, which was a 12-foot diameter circle topped by a geodesic dome with glass panels. The hummingbirds just loved it. They thought it was a gigantic flower, and they kept getting trapped.
Did Al see the dead and play a community role when they came through Veneta?
Oh, yeah, you bet.
We'll have more with Al Strobel next time. Though the commune scene might seem like it was on the far-out opposite end of the countercultural spectrum from the radical political left, there was at least some surprising crossover. Larry Roberts.
One of the things that was kind of interesting in terms of the interplay between the political and the counterculture was that, even though I didn't know them at the time, some of the people who were underground, from Weather Underground and Black Panthers and stuff, were hiding out under assumed identities in these communes. And one commune that I visited, some friend said, "You've got to come meet the people at this place. It's very cool," which it was. But to get to it, you sort of wander down this path, and then there was like a small river or a big creek. And the only way to get access to the commune was to take a little zip line across the river. And I remember asking, "What's the point of that?" It says, "Well, if the cops come or the FBI comes, and we'll have a little warning before they actually get to us." So I assumed that they had reason to not want the police to show up.
There was one in Crow. There was a Rainbow family that was in Cottage Grove further south. Around that same time, we had a gathering in the Three Sisters Wilderness. That was a lot of people that formed the Rainbow family.
The pranksters had their own, let's say, call it camp, and the Rainbow family at the Rainbow Farm had their camp, but that when it came time to build the stage, that the Rainbow Farmers and the pranksters collaborated.
In these episodes, Strider is going to be our avatar for the Veneta benefit for the Springfield Creamery. He took a long route to get there, but a fascinating one that encapsulates the summer of '72 pretty well. Strider was a pretty serious East Coast dead freak.
I'd been seeing the dead already for a couple of years, and I'd gone to 3 of the Academy of Music shows, and so I was still at home, but getting ready to drive out west with 3 friends. I had been out there visiting my sister in Sausalito the summer before and up to Oregon to visit my brother the August before.
Turns out Strider's the guy yelling for White Rabbit on the Berkeley Community Theater 71 tape, added himself to a tradition we discussed at length last season.
I made up my mind that as soon as I got out of high school in June of '72, I was moving out west to Oregon. I moved out of home right after high school graduation in June of '72. We headed out that first day from Connecticut, and we were somewhere on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and we stopped at a rest area, and there was a like an old bread truck that on the side was painted Rainbow Family of Living Light, and we were given the old Rainbow Oracle. That was definitely a sign. We had planned on going to that first Rainbow gathering when we had set out anyway.
At a few points during the Veneta show, you can hear references to the Rainbow Farm.
There was a poor man from the Rainbow Farm making his way out here today by panhandling a little money and got busted for it. Now the Rainbow Farm boys, they poor folks and they need money. So if any of you like to contribute for his $27 bail, come to the side of the stage where the Rainbow Farmers are. They'll accept it.
Same rainbows. The Rainbow Gathering of the Tribes, organized in part by the Rainbows of Eugene, was scheduled to take place soon.
Barry Adams, a.k.a. Plunker, had been going around and saying, "We will meet at noon on 4th of July, 1972, at the top of Table Mountain in Colorado." And that was his mantra.
He'd been a character at the Oregon Renaissance Fair, where Richard Sutton of the Creamery met him.
I first met him at somewhere, I think probably at one of the Renaissance fairs up at Veneta, and he was just sitting there. He had a thing that he was playing. It was a giant coconut shell with a hole in it, a bridge, a stick for a neck, and 2 or 3 strings. And he was just boink, 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 boink. And people were gathered around, and somebody would bring a drum. The next thing you'd know, something else was going on. And I never even knew his last name was Adams. I only just knew him as Barry Plunker.
The guy who gave us the copy of the Rainbow Oracle there at that rest stop in Pennsylvania, our first day west, he was an older guy who he had a long flowing beard, and can't remember the exact clothing that he had, but he definitely had the look and vibe of somebody out of maybe the Old Testament or somewhere, somehow.
We've posted a link to the original Rainbow Oracle at dead.net/deadcast. Heads were to gather high on the mountain and ohm together until the magic happened, and they summoned New Jerusalem and other heaviness. Strider and his friends had a long adventure and encountered many dead freaks en route, at the Rainbow Gathering and elsewhere. We're only going to hear the most abbreviated version. After all, we've got a dead show to catch. One of Strider's travel mates was Danno Hikinin. This part of their experience at the Rainbow Gathering is an instructive counterpoint to how the Springfield Creamery event wouldn't unfold.
As soon as Woodstock happened, from that summer onward, the status quo establishment, the powers that be, the man, the pigs, however you want to put it, had decided that they were going to clamp down on this situation and smother it. And not only were hippies being beaten up everywhere, but hippie events were being quashed everywhere.
A few summers earlier, he'd witnessed it firsthand at the Powder Ridge Rock Festival in Connecticut, which was to have included Sly and the Family Stone, Janis Joplin, the Allman Brothers, Joe Cocker, Van Morrison, Fleetwood Mac, and more.
You know, Powder Ridge, when it was first planned, was going to be another Woodstock, and it was quashed. But I was there.
That wasn't going to be happening at the first Rainbow Gathering.
I've been navigating with a USGS topographical map since I was a 14-year-old Boy Scout, and I knew how to do orienteering and all that stuff. Orienting with a map and compass, using a silver compass, the whole 9 yards. So I looked at my friends and I said, not to worry, I can get us into the site.
It was an adventure unto itself.
So the four of us started towards the gathering, and there was a mountain that we had to go over.
Yeah, that'll happen. It's an adventure we can't totally get into today, except to point it out as one of the types of worlds heads were creating that summer. Like the dead themselves, the Rainbow Gathering would be a thread of energy continued forward from the 60s. The Rainbow Gathering exposed Strider to new ideas, and of course, good old Grateful Dead freaks.
I grew up as a Catholic and stopped going to church when I was 14 or something like that. My parents were open-minded enough to realize that, they couldn't force that on me. But certainly the insights that I was getting from Grateful Dead concerts, other concerts, the 2 times I saw the Jefferson Airplane in 1970, other bands, that was certainly the key towards newer realities. And then when I got to the first Rainbow Gathering, I went from being, let's say, raised a Catholic to being somewhat agnostic. I don't think perhaps atheist, but I had a profound sense of a form of spirituality. And it took off from there, you could say.
Strider and his friends made it to the Bay Area.
We wanted to approach San Francisco by way of Marin County, so we went across North Bay, Black Point, North Bay, and we wanted to go to the old, I believe it was Billy Kreutzmann's wife, Susula, had the store called Kumquat May, or I suppose a play on the words of Come What May. A couple of us bought those old, Smiling Jack or Steely Face shirts that on the sides had marijuana plants.
And then eventually to the Eugene area, where Strider met up with his brother and friends at a non-commune